Hello and welcome. This is a series of videos that we're going to do for the genetics unit because apparently students find it one of the more challenging ones. And the focus of most of these videos is going to be Punnett squares and predicting offspring and traits of offspring, which is something that people are always asking for more practice about. But before we get into that, I just want to do some background on inheritance and genetics and use some of the terminology so that you get used to that and establish some background. So we'll get started with that. If you're looking for Punnett square information, you'll want to skip ahead a little bit. And if you want to start at the beginning, then you're in the right place. Let's go. So, before we had any of our modern tools for analyzing genetics, and before we had microscopes or gel electrophoresis or any of that stuff, there were some basics about inheritance that people could already figure out, like parents tend to be mostly like their children or vice versa. So ducks have babies that grow up to be ducks, and corn plants have offspring that grow up to be more corn plants, and people have babies that grow up to be people. But there's some variety in how they look, and genetics is a study of can we predict anything about how offspring are going to be based on their parents. And so let's look at some basic kinds of inheritance and talk about them, and we'll get increasingly complicated as we go along. So let me start with a really simple example that will bore you out of your mind, but I promise it's going somewhere. Let's say we have a country where everyone has brown eyes, and they've all had brown eyes for millions of years, and that's the only thing that they've ever had. So let's pull up a brown color here. Sure, let's do that. And all of these people have brown eyes. Now, you studied DNA and what's in the nucleus of a cell, and you know that people have two copies of each of their chromosomes, which means inside each of these people, there are two chromosomes, a pair of chromosomes, and somewhere on there, there is a location that contains the gene for eye color. There's information on there about how to make pigment that goes in the iris of a person's eye. And in these people, this chromosome would contain the code for brown eyes, and so would this other one. They have two copies of the brown allele because it's all that their civilization has ever seen. So we have this allele says brown, and this one also says brown. So, first distinction we want to make when we're talking about a gene, the gene is the space on the chromosomes where there's information about some kind of trait. So you have a gene for, there's genes that are about musical talent, there's genes about whether you have a little dent in your chin or not, and there's a gene for eye color. I'm going to write that in. So the gene is something like eye color. And then we talk about alleles, which are the different forms that this gene can take. In other words, if this is a question, alleles are the possible answers to it. For eye color, for now we're going to keep it simple and say that there are only two alleles, and those are you can have brown eyes or you can have blue eyes. Of course, there are more eye colors than this. It's a little more complicated than we're saying now, but this will get us started. So the gene is eye color. There are two alleles for it, brown and blue. These people have never seen the blue allele ever. They all have two copies of the brown allele. Good so far? So that person has two copies of the brown allele, and I was going to try to copy that, but I'm afraid I'll break the layout, so I'll just draw it again real fast. Here's another person from that same culture, and they also have two chromosomes that each contain a copy of the brown allele. So there isn't a lot of suspense here, is there, if I tell you that two of these people have a kid together? What's going to happen is the sperm cell from one of these parents is going to contain one of these chromosomes with the brown allele in it. The egg from the other parent will also contain a chromosome with the brown allele in it. And when the sperm cell fertilizes the egg, we end up with one new cell for what's going to be their child that contains two copies of the brown allele, and we end up with a child who's going to be just like the parents and have brown eyes. So if you heard them talking about the law of segregation, the law of segregation says you may have two chromosomes for every single thing, but you only get to pass on one of those to your kids because the other parent's going to contribute the other one. So here there are two chromosomes, and we say that they segregated and only one of them is passed on. There's a 50% chance of either one, but in this case, since they both say brown, we don't care which. In the mother over here, there was also segregation, and she only got one of her chromosomes into her egg, and the combination of those two produces a new cell, which we call a daughter cell, no matter what the gender of the kid is. And so the kid ends up with two chromosomes, and those contain brown and brown also. So nothing too amazing yet. If you imagine for a moment that there's, let's get the brown-eyed people out of the way for a second. If we have another country over here, let's say all the people over there have blue eyes. In that case, they also have identical chromosomes, eye color wise, so each of them has two chromosomes for eye color. We're still talking about the gene for eye color, which is in the same place on their chromosomes, but the information there is different. Where these people's chromosomes have instructions that say, make this protein that is brown, these people produce a different protein in their eyes that produces a blue color. And so we say that they carry the blue allele. And if this is a country where everyone has had blue eyes since time immemorial, then they have two copies of the blue allele. And of course, if two of these people have a kid, that kid will get the blue allele from dad, they'll get the blue allele from mom also, and blue-eyed baby. So far nothing you couldn't have guessed yourself, but where it gets interesting is, let's have a love story with a blue person and a brown-eyed person. What happens when they meet? Is it a 50-50? Do we get a color that's between brown and blue? Here's what happens. One of these parents has two chromosomes that both have the blue allele on them. The other parent also has two chromosomes that both carry the brown allele. But the law of segregation says they each only get to pass on one of those alleles. So, kid is going to get the blue allele from one parent and the brown allele from the other one. And in our imaginary world, if this is the first time this has ever happened, what happens when blue and brown meet? Do they fight? Do they cancel out? Well, not exactly either of those things. It turns out when this happens, every single time, the child has brown eyes. And there's no trace of the blue whatsoever. And this is one of our first important observations, is that some genes some traits override other traits. If you have a parent who carries nothing but brown eyes and a person who carries nothing but blue eyes, the blue eyes get overwritten and you get a child with brown eyes. And the terminology we use for this is we say that brown eyes, or the brown eye allele, are dominant. As in, if there's a conflict between brown and blue, the brown wins. Brown eyes are dominant, and the blue eyes, the losing trait, if you will, the one that gets overruled, is called recessive. Recessive means it hides. So, If a person has nothing but the brown eye allele, they have brown eyes, no problem. If a person has nothing but the blue-eyed allele, blue eyes, no problem. If a person has one of each, it turns out the brown wins. And we call those dominant and recessive, and there's a code that we use for them where we use capital letters to denote dominant alleles and lowercase letters to show recessive alleles. So the way that we would code something like this is we'll pick a letter for the two alleles and we'll use the capital for the dominant trait, lowercase for the recessive. In this case, it would be reasonable to use the letter E for eye color, but because brown and blue both start with B, they tend to use B's for this, and they'll do something like the brown allele will be capital B, and the blue allele will be lowercase b. And in that case, a person who has two copies of the brown allele, like everyone in brown-eyed land, gets capital B, capital B. That means they have two chromosomes that both carry the same allele, the brown-eyed one. The people over here carry two copies of the blue allele, little b, little b. And what happened here when these two people got together, we would write as little b, cross big B, big B. And this cross represents had a child with. And they use this for people and plants and animals interchangeably. It just, they call it a crossing or a mating, and they use those terms no matter what species they're talking about. So when these two people had a child, this parent passed on a lowercase b, the recessive blue allele. This parent passed on one of their copies of uppercase B, the dominant brown-eyed allele. And their kid is now big B, little b. When there are two of these, you notice I swapped the order here. It is customary to put the capital letter first, just because that's how we would normally write English anyway. You put capitals at the beginning of words, not in the middle. So if there's a capital letter, you put it at the beginning and you say big B, little b. If you write little b, big B, you will weird people out and confuse them, and don't do it, please. Capital first all the time. So this child is big B, little b, and because the capital B is dominant, the brown eyes are dominant, they end up with brown eyes. This is like hiding. That's what recessive means. They're carrying it, but so far it hasn't shown itself. They're genetically a little bit different from both of their parents. One of their parents was big B, big B. Their other parent was little b, little b. They're neither of those. They're a mix, but you wouldn't know it just to look at their eyes. But you will know it when they have kids, which we're going to look at in just a moment. So, one more thing before I get off of this slide. We use these two terms, genotype and phenotype, to talk about the genetic information inside a person and how they look. For this person, their genotype is the two alleles that they carry, little b, little b. You could say that you could just say they're little b, or you can say that they are homozygous recessive. Or if you're talking fast and you don't feel like saying homozygous, you can say double recessive. Means they have two copies of the recessive allele. That's their genotype. It's the genetic information inside them. Their phenotype, pheno looks like photo. Pheno is what do they actually look like? And in this case, the answer is blue eyes. Right? So that's the genotype is homozygous recessive, and the phenotype is they have blue eyes. For the people over here, the genotype is they have two copies of the dominant allele, so you can say they're homozygous dominant. You can say double dominant. It's a little informal, but people will totally understand you if you do. And for the phenotype, you just say they have brown eyes. And for the kid down here, they have one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive. The term we use for that is heterozygous. Heterozygous. Hetero means different or mixed. In this case, it means you have two different alleles, and you don't have to say dominant or recessive because this automatically means one of each. So just saying that this kid is heterozygous is enough there, and for their phenotype, that's the genotype. The phenotype is they have brown eyes. So, important point, two people can have the same phenotype, meaning they look the same as far as one trait is concerned, but there can be different genotypes behind that. If you see a brown-eyed person, you don't know if they're big B or big B little b. No way to tell just looking at them because they both have brown eye color. If you see a blue-eyed person, you automatically know they're double recessive and they're little b. So this is easy to figure out. But if you see a dominant trait, you're like, well, there's two ways that could have happened. They could have double dominant or they could be heterozygous. Good so far? Okay. I'm going to clear the screen and then let's look at some grandchildren and see if we can see what happens when this gets a little more complex. What if, think about the kid from the previous page. This kid is big B little b and has brown eyes. One of their parents was from blue land and the other one was from brown land. They're a mix. As far as they know right now, they just look like their brown-eyed parent, but there's more to it that we'll see in just a moment. So here is a kid with brown eyes, or they're going to be a parent soon, so let's stop calling him a kid. Here's a person with brown eyes who had one brown-eyed parent and one blue-eyed parent, and we know their genotype is big B little b. Now, if this happens more than once, here is another person in the exact same situation. Big B little b, but they also have brown eyes. And they meet. What could their kids look like? What happens when you cross these two people? Dad has a dominant allele and a recessive allele, and he could pass on either one. There's a 50% chance of each, so the sperm cell that produces his child could be a capital B, or it could be a lowercase b. Mom, who is also big B little b, could produce an egg with a big B in it, the brown-eyed allele, or she could produce one with the little b, the blue-eyed allele. And it turns out there are 4 ways that those could combine. We could get the dominant, the big B from Dad, and the big B from Mom. I'll show you a systematic way to find these in a moment, but for now I'm just going to list them off. We could get this, big B's from each parent. We could get big B from Dad, but little b from Mom. We could get little b from Dad, big B from Mom. Remember, we write the big one first, no matter what order they came from. So it doesn't matter which of these came from which parent. We always put the dominant one first if there is one. Or, last possibility, we could get little b from Dad and little b from Mom. What would these kids look like? Big B is brown and brown again. This is definitely brown eyes. This is like one of the grandparents. Remember, we had one of the parents was from Brownland and had big B. One of their grandchildren could turn out exactly like them and also get big B. One from the dad, one from the mom. they end up, you remember what this is called? Homozygous dominant. This one, what color are the eyes here? Still brown, right? Because there's a capital B and that overrides the little b. This kid also has brown eyes, but they're heterozygous like their parents. Their parents had a big B and a little b. So did this kid. They got the big B from one parent, the little b from the other. Brown eyes. This kid, same thing. The alleles came from the other parents, but it doesn't matter if an allele came from your mom or your dad. It works the same either way. So again, heterozygous, brown eyes. And this kid is very interesting because their parents both had brown eyes, but they don't. When we say that an allele is recessive, recessive means that it can hide or it can disappear. The blue eyes were hiding in both of these parents. Neither of these parents had them, but that little b was hiding in there, and here it is showing up. This trait was carried by the father and by the mother, and if they both pass on the little b, then the blue trait reappears, and you can have two brown-eyed parents having a blue-eyed child. Sometimes they talk about this as skipping a generation. They'll say that my grandfather had blue eyes, but I don't have blue eyes and neither does my wife. We're both brown, but now our child has blue eyes. They'll say the blue eyes skipped. Neither of the parents had them, but then they reappeared in the grandchildren's generation. So if you hear generation skip, that's generally associated with a recessive trait. It means that it was there, but it took a certain combination of sperm cell and egg for it to show up again. This kid will, of course, pass on the blue-eyed allele. It's all they have. These kids will be able to pass on either one, 50% chance, and these kids will pass on dominant brown alleles because that's all they have. All right, so the way that I did these combinations was kind of off the cuff. There's a system for it called a Punnett square, which we'll look at in the next video. But for now, I just wanted to talk about the general ideas of how inheritance happens, when it can get interesting, where you have kids that don't look anything like their parents, and some of the language that we use when we're talking about it. So I hope this helped get you situated, and in the next videos, we're going to get into Punnett squares, starting with some really easy ones and working up to the more complicated stuff. And we'll try to go through it in plenty of detail so that you can see how they work and get good at them yourself.